I was off. I was completely off. I didn't realize kind of the strength and power of what can happen when you're liberated from the brain and body, which is
Right.
exactly what happens in a near-death experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eben Alexander, for joining us today on Lifting Our Vibration podcast. I am so honored. If you do not know who Dr. Eben Alexander is, he was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
And including 15 years at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School in Boston. In 2008, he experienced a transcendental near-death experience during a week-long coma from an inexplicable brain infection that completely transformed his worldview. So thank you again for coming, Doctor. And yes, we were talking a little bit before the recording. I'm sorry, can you continue what you were saying, please?
Well, yes. Well, Kevin, thanks so much. It's great to be on here today with you, and I appreciate the invitation. Yeah, important to point out that for my coma, I'd spent all that time in academic neurosurgery, thought I understood brain, mind, consciousness to some degree. But again, I had been trained, as most of us have been, in the kind of materialism or physicalism of the 20th and early 21st century. And it turns out that that is an outmoded view of reality. Materialism has been pretty much debunked. I mean, just the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 for entanglement in quantum physics was a rejection of the simplistic falsehood of Newtonian determinism. And so I was getting ready to witness full bore how that old model did not work. And it especially does not work around consciousness and the phenomenon of the brain-mind connection. Um, and what happened to me in November 2008, I was driven into coma very rapidly by this severe case of bacterial meningitis. And it turns out that that form of meningitis is really a perfect model for human death.
Mm,
This really should have killed me. In fact, there's a medical case report on my medical records that was written by three doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. That case report came out in September 2018, Journal of uh, uh, Nervous and Mental Disease
mm,
by Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. But anyway, the reason I bring up the case report is it really confirms and validates and extends the case I made in my book, Proof of Heaven, that my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination. That's
mm,
why the scientific community takes my story so seriously, is that kind of a severe meningitis involving all lobes of the brain doesn't allow for any part of the brain to participate in a dream or hallucination because all that neocortex, the outer surface of the brain, that's what gets affected by meningitis and what makes it so deadly. And but anyway, for me to have this extraordinary, rich, detailed, memorable experience when my brain was in that kind of a state that was so well documented is really remarkable. And that is what gets the attention of the scientific community. Although I'll also point out that in that case report, they were challenged by the peer review editors of the journal. How do you explain this unprecedented recovery?
mm.
And what the authors of the report said is because he had a near death experience, that he was allowed to have this kind of apparently miraculous recovery. They knew of other cases like Anita Moorjani, whose advanced lymphoma vanished when she had a profound spiritual NDE, Dr. Mary C. Neal, whose over 30-minute warm water drowning kayaking in Chile in the late 90s. Um, you know, she shouldn't have survived it at all. She was brought to the surface dead, resuscitated, made a full recovery. Anyway, the point I'm making is that deep in the heart of these stories of rich spiritual journeys are incredible seeds for healing, for
Mm.
coming into wholeness. And that's what I think is so important for the world at large to understand about near-death experiences is how they inform us that we have a tremendous amount of power in these things. And I'll point out here that, um, this is about acknowledging that you're not just that little ego voice in the mind. I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that running stream of consciousness in our head the annoying roommate. And this is a very important concept because in my NDE, what I learned was the difference between kind of my ego mind, ego self, and that higher soul that's interconnected with the God force and with all fellow beings, etc. And so
Wow.
ever since my NDE, I've had a kind of a rich theater of investigation to kind of push the boundaries of that higher soul across the veil. And that's something that I really learned from the NDE itself. And we can
Wow.
do a little more about that if you have any specific questions or issues around it.
Yes, that's incredible. And I definitely want to talk more about that, about how the spontaneous healing was directly connected with NDEs and how that is, and the spiritual component to most pathologies, and how maybe we should be looking at pathologies in a different way. Can you talk a little bit about leading up to the experience that you had? Like, was your life on track? Did you feel like you were spiritually minded? Why do you feel now, looking back, that this happened to you? And what was happening before this happened?
Well, NDEs are always tailored to the individual, so they really have no other reason for being. And I think this one had a lot to do with big issues in my life. For example, I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 years old and unwed back in 1953. Social services took me from her at age 11 days, but she was unwilling to sign the papers to let me go. So I got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. And then I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family that honored all my dreams. So there's no appeal for sympathy in this case, but I can tell you that being left behind by my mother and put in a baby dorm for months is not the best way to start your life in terms
Right.
of having a loving, nurturing, kind of maternal bond relationship. That just didn't exist for me. And so there was a kind of a deep subconscious doubt in my mind that I was even worthy of existence. And so this huge existential journey of this profound NDE at age 54 um, helped me to resolve some of the deepest and most ancient issues of my life, in particular that adoption abandonment wound. And what I found in my NDE was an incredibly rich source of love and connection with the universe at large that completely negated that old sense of maybe I wasn't meant to be here because my own birth mother gave me away. So
Right.
that's the kind of depth of psychology that you have to get into to start to understand what this NDE meant to me. And they, as I said, they always are primarily of importance to the individual soul who has them. Although it's interesting when we study them in large numbers, study near-death experiences, you find a lot of commonalities and things that suggest that they're pointing to a very real realm that's part of human existence, but it's just not here in our physical, four-dimensional space-time. But it's a more fundamental level of being. For example, when people describe life reviews in a near-death experience, and life reviews have been described going back at least 2,500 years, if not more, in the writings of Plato about Armenian soldier killed in battle. And in that early report, the life review, he said, your life flashes before your eyes when you die. And what you find is the only important thing is how much love you were able to share with the world. That from a Armenian soldier killed in battle 2,400 years ago. So that kind of gives us a glimpse of what these life reviews involve. And I'll point out that life reviews, when you study them in large numbers, for example, Bruce Grayson, a skeptical psychiatrist, MD at University of Virginia, who studied NDEs for more than 45 years, what you find is these incredible patterns suggesting the shared reality of those journeys. And they inform us as to what all of us can expect. And the interesting thing about that world, as I discovered, going into it, starting out in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, course, unresponsive realm, but then being led up through this portal of light associated with music and melody and harmony up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley, where I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing with millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And the best thing was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing. And I'll never forget her sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones. She looked at me with a look of pure love, and her message was very simple. I think it's the message I was to bring back to this world. And that is, You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how comforting that was. And that message delivered in that fashion, that beautiful heavenly realm, was really all I needed. And it was my reminder of this rich spiritual home that we share, of my spiritual nature. And from then on, I witnessed, as I describe in the book Proof of Heaven, this uh, incredible valley with thousands of beings dancing below that I called souls between lives. And it was this incredible sense of that divine force, that God force that I first witnessed as what I called the soft summer breeze blowing through. But that was my awareness given a state of amnesia. It's important to point out that one of the unusual features of my near-death experience was amnesia, that I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. I had no language, no knowledge of Earth or this universe. It really was an empty slate. And
Mhm.
don't worry, that's not one I've ever heard happen to other people. But in my particular case, as a neuroscientist fascinated by consciousness who really wanted to see some of the deeper revelations about the brain-mind relationship, that's what this entailed. And that involved losing all my personal memories. But in fact, that was just to demonstrate to me that those memories were not even stored in the brain, because those memories returned completely over the next 2 months after I woke up from coma. And in fact, they were more complete than they had been before coma. We discuss all that in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that memories are not even stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. And yet, when you recognize that another major arm of research concerning consciousness in this discussion is that whole body of evidence that we have reincarnation, that there are children with past life memories that suggest reincarnation. And in fact, the University of Virginia, for the last 6 or 7 decades, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And in those cases, they've discovered 1,700 that they call solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived before. And when you study that literature, you'll realize this is a very strong, scientifically rigorous body of evidence. And most of us say, well, I don't remember past lives, so they can't be real. But as Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson, who did this research, will tell you, you need to ask these children these questions and seek their history before age 6 or 7, because after age 6 or 7, they're natural processes that cover up our memories of past lives and between lives. And
Wow.
that's what most of us say we don't remember them. And for whatever reason, at the current level of human development, this program forgetting, as I call it, is part of the package. It kind of gives us skin in the game to live these lives. If we had all that knowledge of our higher soul about prior lifetimes and all this, we might tend to have a very different viewpoint of this life, because we'd realize that death is an illusion, that our conscious awareness continues. And in fact, I would say that one of the biggest, richest lessons of NDEs is that all of us have these capacities of kind of spiritual guidance of our lives. And in complete contradiction to the materialist, physicalist science that I was taught, and that science would actually scoff at you for even claiming to have free will, because it's not a very quantum informed vision of consciousness. But what is emerging now, given the science of near death experiences, the science of consciousness in general, all the evidence for non local consciousness, the fact that materialism, that is, thinking that only the physical world exists, can somehow explain all this, has never gone anywhere. And as I said a few minutes ago, materialism itself is pretty much gone now, because scientists have realized through quantum physics and entanglement that there are information pathways in this universe that basically short circuit and avoid the kind of four-dimensional space-time that we normally think is such a theater of operations here. And to fully open the door to an understanding of that kind of consciousness and time flow, you have to realize that life reviews, studied in large numbers, are a reliving of events, not just a remembering of events. And not only that, they're relived from the perspective of everybody involved. so that when you go through a life review, your life review, you'll actually become the other souls around you who are impacted by your thoughts and actions. So if you've been busy handing out a lot of pain and suffering to others, or been very greedy and selfish, your life review is not going to be much fun because you'll be on the receiving end of all that negative behavior. And
Mhm.
in fact, so life reviews are kind of like the golden rule written into the fabric of the universe: treat others as you would like to be treated. And
Yes.
that it points out the primary lesson of near-death experiences is unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness. And for me, I learned that a lot of this involved how I treat myself
Mm.
and could forgive myself for things that I thought I'd done wrong, that I didn't deserve to be here because my mother had left me behind. Well, that wasn't my fault. And that was something that I had to address going through this whole process and coming to a much richer sense of personal identity that transcends and goes way above and beyond that little ego sense. Because the
Mm.
ego just gets us into tremendous trouble. And realizing the higher good and the focus of unconditional love for our fellow beings that emerges with this kind of understanding. And it's something any of us can develop through meditation and centering prayer. You don't have to have a near-death experience to come to know all of what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
But to take some time out for meditation, and for people who need a tool for meditation, if that little monkey mind voice in your head is too insistent and refuses to go away, I can offer a very powerful tool in the form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And for that, I would suggest sacredacoustics.com. If you go check that out, you'll see what I mean. Full disclosure, that is the website of my partner and co-author of my book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But she's also my wife, and we've been together for more than 11 or 12 years now, doing this kind of work. And she is the one who co-founded Sacred Acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment, extremely powerful tool to help people get into deep transcendental states of conscious awareness. And
Mhm.
that's where all of us can start to come into real healing, as we're realized that we're much more than our physical body, much more than this sense of, personality with birth, death, and nothing more, but that we've had other lifetimes. We have a soul line, that we have a soul group, that we are here to learn and teach with our fellow soul mates. And that all of this, as we expand our awareness of this kind of grander vision of reality, allows us for us to manifest the dreams of our higher soul. So, in other words, that brings us into wholeness and healing. And that's exactly where your work and my work as a healer comes in very handy, is to acknowledge this incredible power we have within ourselves to bring wholeness and healing and wellness into our existence by channeling this beautiful love of the universe for us and channeling to the rest of our fellow beings, serving as a source of love, kindness, compassion, mercy, and acceptance. And this is where healing comes from.
Yeah, that is incredible. Do you feel like there is a spiritual component to every pathology, when even if someone stubs their toe, is there something that their spirit guides, if you believe in such a thing as spirit guides, is trying to tell them in that situation?
Well, I'd certainly say that hardships are a gift, and that was something I didn't really recognize before my coma. But the hardship, for example, of being put up for adoption,
Mm.
that ended up being a tremendous gift in my life as I came to a full resolution of it. And if I'd never had that adoption abandonment wound, I never would have gained the power of self-realization that
Mhm.
came through this extraordinary NDE experience and that kind of thing. So hardships should be embraced. And it's really how we deal with them. I think, in fact, I think our soul groups have agreements where we have certain hardships that we will face when we come into this world. But we can do that together, and we can learn and live and grow together and transform as souls together. And it just comes from having a much grander awareness of all of our existence, and really kind of getting to that point that I got to by the end of my coma, when I finally woke up and they pulled out the breathing tube. And I was sitting there on the bed. My younger sister Phyllis told me the story because I don't remember those first 36 hours of coming out of coma. I mean, they're very blurry for me because the meningitis was still very active at impacting my kind of awareness of things. So, but that was I remember my sister told me I was sitting there on the bed, and this is like 30 minutes after I'd awakened from a week-long coma, where the doctors had expected that I was just going to die and had just recommended taking me off the ventilator. And there I am looking at each person at the bedside, doctor, nurse, family, friend, and going, don't worry, all is well. And I'd reassure each and every one of them that all is well. And that incredible assurance of kind of well-being and kind of perfection in the current scheme of things was a gift that I received from this extraordinary journey that I'd just been through. And that's one of the reasons why I love to share the entire story. I shared it in the book Proof of Heaven, in the hundreds and hundreds of talks that I've given, podcasts, etc., because I think it's an important lesson for the world to know. And this is about a scientific revolution that
Yes.
we are in the midst of. And it's a revolution that understands that the cold mechanics of materialism are false. That is not the big story of what is going on here. And that in fact, what these stories and many other lines of evidence, as we covered in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, prove is consciousness is fundamental in the universe. The physical universe emerges from the realm of consciousness. And this is where wholeness and healing can come in so handy as we take this kind of broader view of ourselves and of our powers, our ability to traverse that veiling function, the filtering function of the brain, and get into that rich territory of the spiritual world with all of its possibilities. That's where we go through life reviews. That's where we recognize how things, all the options to us are still available, and that those can be planted for a next life. If we learn the lessons of this life, if we successfully navigate that life review and have the learned lessons of love and kindness, compassion, then we can reshuffle the issues we face in our next lifetime, the kind of hurdles and challenges we'll face and help each other through. But that all of it is a much grander picture than I ever realized before. And that in many ways, this is a scientific revolution, as I said. As we cover in Living in a Mindful Universe, it involves quantum physics, neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness, philosophy of mind, and what's called the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in the individual, which is very tough to explain from a materialist standpoint of many neuronal populations contributing to consciousness. And then all about evidence for non-local consciousness out of parapsychology, including near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death, but happen to perfectly healthy people, usually a relative of a loved one who's passing over. And combination of all this information in science leads us to conclude that consciousness is fundamental and that free will is alive and well, as opposed to what materialism would tell you, where they'd scoff at you for claiming to have free will, saying it's all chemical reactions and electron fluxes in the brain. Well, free will and quantum indeterminacy go hand in hand. And this is all about realizing kind of the higher dreams of our higher soul to make the world of our ideals come into manifestation.
Wow. Wow. So, you being a scientist, it's really impactful that you've had this experience and that you can help influence the scientific world and to change our view. Now, it seems like it takes a while for things to trickle down into the general population. Would you say that right now the broader scientific community is grasping and accepting these concepts, or is there more work to be done in that?
I would say they are definitely getting more and more on board, and I'll give you and your people a resource, very important, bigalowinstitute.org. In 2021, Robert Bigalow, an aerospace engineer in Las Vegas, had lost his wife. His son had committed suicide. He wondered, is there any scientific evidence that their souls are really still around? So he put the question out to the scientific community, what's the best evidence for continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? And they stipulated you had to show at least 5 years of research experience studying the afterlife question. In that context, they received 204 essays. Bigelow's original intent was to give out 3 monetary awards, but these essays were of such high quality, they gave out 29 monetary awards. All 29 essays are available for free for the reading public right now at bigelowinstitute.org. If you start with Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay, you will see quickly that this question has been settled beyond a doubt that the afterlife is real from a modern scientific perspective. And so Jeffrey Mishlov, an incredibly great essay to start it all off. But then there are many other essays in that group, that a group of 29, some of which are extremely scientific, like Bernardo Castro, Dean Radin, Julie Beischel, Pim van Lommel. These are all incredibly well-written, scientifically based essays that prove not only the afterlife, but reincarnation. And so the evidence is there. So henceforth, any materialist scientist, militant atheist who claims this is all nonsense, there's no such thing as NDEs, they're hallucinations, tricks of the dying brain, they're simply confessing that they're either too lazy or too disinterested to be aware of the Bigalow Institute essays. But those essays take this whole conversation to a much higher new level, where the scientific support of the afterlife and the primacy of consciousness is right at the heart of the discussion. And this has everything to do with healing and coming into wholeness. Because if we just follow our ego mind, the ego, for one thing, is deeply involved in every case of addiction. And addictions are kind of maladaptions to life that have to do with the demands of the ego. And this is where growing into our higher soul is so important. And that's where meditation and centering prayer can certainly assist in the effort to rise above and beyond the petty demands of the ego. And this is where, that sacred acoustics, as I said, and other techniques of going within, following this whole line of evidence, as we have in the Bigelow essays in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, you start to realize we're living in a very brave new world that's acknowledging we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. We have tremendous responsibility for our unfolding reality. And that certainly begins front and center with our very health. So that any physical, mental, emotional healing is ultimately based in spiritual healing. And spiritual, when I use that word, it doesn't demand any form of religion at all, but spirituality really has three ingredients. One is a sense of connection with the minds of the universe, the minds of all our fellow beings, that there is truly a mental connection we share. And that's what the science is proving very strongly. But the other two main ingredients are that we have shared meaning and purpose in our lives. And this is where I think we can start growing into a much grander vision of what we can bring to this world and the great possibilities for humanity and harmony and prosperity going into the future as we acknowledge the will that we have, as long as we're admitting and living this life of love, compassion, kindness, and mercy for all of our fellow beings, beginning with ourselves, but not in an egotistical way, but in that much grander kind of life review way where we realize we're in this together to help each other.
Wow. Wow. Do you feel like when you were in that other realm and you had the spontaneous healing and you heard the music, and now I hear you talk about the sacred acoustics, which is amazing. I didn't know that that was your wife that was doing that work. I'm familiar with her work.
Uh-huh.
Do you feel like that sacred acoustics is what had healed you, that music that was happening? Is there a connection there?
Well, what I would say is, for one thing, my NDE informed me very clearly that what we call music, vibration, frequency, melody, rhythms, things like that, is something that ties us into the very basic frequencies of the universe. And to me, it was surprising how simply remembering the musical notes of the melody of when I first encountered that light portal that took me up from the earth for my view into the brilliant ultra real Gateway Valley, music was associated. And it was by the memory of music that I was able to conjure up that light portal multiple times, because I would ascend to these highest levels of the divine and then tumble back down to the lowest spiritual levels. And then came to realize by remembering the musical notes, I could conjure up these light portals and move between layers. So it was actually And of course, you should know that music in those realms is ideal. It's a form of music that goes far beyond anything that we could ever construct in our four-dimensional space-time. I'm convinced that that's the realm where composers and gifted musicians get their greatest inspirations, is from that same kind of platonic level of ideals. Um, and for me, music was a tremendous part of this. And so it turns out, though, that the whole theme of music and sacred acoustics is different. I was introduced to the concept of binaural beat brainwave entrainment as a neuroscientist about 2 years after my coma, when I'd read hundreds of books trying to understand my experience, but finally realized that ultimately, to understand it, I had to meditate. I had to go within consciousness. And for me, meditation is always a form of centering prayer, because it focuses on that infinitely loving God force at the core of reality that I first encountered in my NDE. And I will point out that it doesn't matter if you're trying to label that force as God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, all the many names humans have dreamt up. The thing to acknowledge is the common reality of that infinitely loving, compassionate, merciful force. And that is what more than 90% of near-death experiencers throughout all of history, some of whom had previously been militant atheists or agnostics, but 90% plus of NDEers come back to this world believing that there is truly a force, a benevolent force at the core of the universe, no matter what name you want to call it, but they witness the same thing. And so for our religions to try and teach us that it's different and that maybe you went to the wrong address is false. That this is all about that infinitely loving force that's available to all of us when we take the time to go within and put our little ego into timeout, because the ego is going to use fear and anxiety and really try and rattle your cage. And that's why the ego is not your ally in this kind of journey of self-discovery. But meditation and centering prayer and opening up to your higher soul are absolutely part of it. And what I found is that early on, I had difficulty trying to meditate. That little voice in my head, the annoying roommate, as Michael Singer puts it, was very loud. But what I discovered is by writing the tones of sacred acoustics, so binaural beat brainwave entrainment, I was able to put that voice of my ego into timeout. It usually makes a request, states an intention at the beginning of a meditation, but then it goes into timeout, and I've learned to ride those musical tones of sacred acoustics. They're very powerful, and it has to do with creating an oscillation in your lower brainstem. Just
Mm,
like we've all heard of using a pendulum as a visual target, with the eye movements, and that tends to put people in a hypnotic state. Likewise, with EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, a very effective treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. EMDR is also using rapid movements, oscillations in the midbrain, down in the lower brainstem. But what we're doing with sacred acoustics is actually going to an even more primitive level. What part of the brainstem that evolutionarily arose more than 300 million years ago. And that's why I think it has such great power. And by causing this oscillation in the lower brainstem, that's what allows our conscious awareness to be free of the normal system of our body and our conscious awareness and being in the here, now, and sense of self. But these sacred acoustics tones allow you to get into a hypnagogic state, just like between awake and asleep, where you're basically then in a role of being a lucid dreamer and allowing the universe to feed into that information field of what you need to know. And that's where souls of departed loved ones, guides, angels, those kinds of spiritual influences can start to interact and help us in living our lives.
wow. I think people might have a difficulty understanding the concept of what the ego is. When we talk about ego, a lot of times people think about being narcissistic. Oh, that's your ego, But ego, let me know if you agree. It's kind of our interface with this three-dimensional world. So when we come here, we interact with the world through our emotions, and we interact with our emotions through our ego. As far as jealousy, anger, things that we probably wouldn't experience when we know that we're one with source. So the ego does play a pretty important role, do you think? And what are some ways that your ego has evolved, or and that you can maybe help people to escape that ego trap that we're
I think
experiencing?
remember that the ego is mainly using fear and anxiety as its tool. So, and this is what drives addictions and drives some forms of mental illness, et cetera. And I agree with you. I think the ego is important. You know, it serves as that primary interface that allows us to exist in this world. And you know, at a superficial level, yes, it helps us to kind of maintain a self-focus and try and take care of self. But it ultimately can be very damaging in terms of what it demands that is unrealistic about our relationships with others and our understanding of events in our lives and things like that. And this is where I think it's especially important to remind people of that role of egos in addictions. And addiction is, you know, very prominent in our world. I'm not just talking about alcoholism and drug addiction, but you know, people can be addicted to other facets of life, like exercise, addicted to work, addicted to love, addicted to sex. I mean, these things can start to wreck our lives. And an addiction just means that it's unhealthy because you're so focused that you pretty much channel energy mainly through that kind of ego satisfying domain. And that's where we start to really run into trouble. And that's where I think this kind of bigger view that we can cultivate. And of course, many of us have that naturally, especially if we're old souls, but younger souls don't. And they can be kind of tempted towards narcissism and egocentrism. But that's where awakening to these possibilities and understanding this kind of bigger concept of who we can be beyond the typical concepts of self and ego, but part of this larger collective. That's exactly what you see in life reviews of NDEs, is that we're sharing the dream of the one mind. In many ways, we're promoting the evolution and transformation of all of universal consciousness itself through our efforts as a contributing sentient being to living these lives. But it really is, it's taking that broader perspective. And I'll give one example of what I think is involved in terms of that addiction and ego. And this has to do with the work of Roland Griffiths, who's at Johns Hopkins, although sadly he passed from this world last October. But he's really the father of the modern reintroduction of psychedelic substances or entheogens, plant medicines, into the study of kind of human existence and behavior. And he did one study where he looked at people with severe ego issues, addictions, alcoholism, opiate, nicotine addiction, one of the toughest physiologic addictions there is. And also looked at a group of people, terminal cancer patients with a debilitating fear of death. And what he found is in these big patient populations with these severe ego problems, that one dose of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, was enough so that a year later, these people still, 80% of them still had benefits in solving, being rid of their addiction or their terminal fear of death. Very important that they didn't have to keep taking the substance, only take it one time. And what I would point out is I think that that could also be achieved through meditation. In fact, I'm musing over the study to compare the single dose psilocybin with a meditation using sacred acoustics. Because, for example, sacred acoustics has a very proven scientific track record in the form of a pilot study by Dr. Anna Newsom, a psychiatrist in New York City, who used binaural beat brainwave entrainment in form of sacred acoustics in her patients and found that anxiety relief happened in 26% of anxiety symptoms were relieved in her patients listening to sacred acoustics over 2 weeks. And that's versus only a 7% reduction in those anxiety symptoms in people who got standard talk therapy. So just listening to the sacred acoustics tones was enough to give them tremendous relief from their anxiety. That was written up in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, published in February of 2020. Dr. Anna Newsom, as I said, and a very powerful confirmation, I promise you, if it's giving that great an effect on anxiety in a busy Manhattan practice, it's
Mhm.
also helping with a lot of other things like people's uh, uh, difficulty in their lives, needing guidance, seeking kind of higher soul clarity. These are all things that can be accomplished through centering prayer and meditation. And if people need an additional tool, sacredacoustics.com can be that very powerful tool.
Awesome. Thank you. So I want to be mindful of your time, but I have a couple more questions for you if that is okay.
Yeah.
Um, After your NDE, did you come back with any gifts or some psychic ability or expanded awareness or anything like that?
Well, after my NDE, one thing that I did notice, although I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time, was a lot of the microelectronic effects.
Mhm.
Turns out you often hear of people after an NDE, and the things that would happen to me, for example, is walking down the street under street lights would go out as I walked under them. And I thought, that's just, poor infrastructure or something like that. It took me, I had to go through 3 watches before I found a watch that would work. All my watches just stopped. Um, and also my computer would crash a lot more than it used to. And again, I thought I blamed it on infrastructure. And
Mhm.
only did I find out later that those are kind of typical after effects from an NDE because your psychic energy is so charged up that you have an excessive kind of quantum effect on these microelectronics. In fact,
Mhm.
there's a book on that. It's called Margins of Reality, written by Brenda Dunn, I think it is, and Robert John, Jahn. They were with the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the PAIR Lab, and wrote a whole book, Margins of Reality, on quantum effects in microelectronics from consciousness. And I know Dean Radin has done some beautiful work out at noetics.org. He's done experiments showing how meditators can influence the double slit experiment as one example of consciousness having an influence on quantum effects. So there's a lot of science being built up around that very fascinating field. But yes, I did have the microelectronic effects.
Mhm.
In addition, my sense of intuition and empathy, I think, was greatly enhanced. I remember my oldest son, Eben the fourth, who came home the day after I got out of the hospital back in 2008, gave me a big hug. And he said it was like there was a light shining within me. I was much more present than I'd ever been before. And Evan gave me the best advice. He was the one, because he was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. He knew every time you revisit a memory, you change it. So he told me to write down everything I could remember about my near death experience before I read anyone else's accounts.
Mm.
That's not what I wanted to hear because after going through this, I wanted to read everybody's account. And he
Right.
was right. I wrote about 20,000 words over the next few weeks. And that was my database. That's my raw data that is uninfluenced by anyone else's NDE because I'd never read that literature before. But after writing all that down, you bet I dove deep into that literature and was absolutely fascinated at a lot of the kind of overlaps. And kind of when I would read these accounts, even though they weren't word for word the same as what I was trying to explain, I could tell from the emotions and the power and the transformation in the person doing the writing that they had had the same kind of profound soul changing experience that I'd had. And that's what I think really gets you when you start to study NDE literature. And then, of course, as we realize that that literature mirrors, for example, the hospice literature. Christopher Kerr wrote a book. He's with Hospice Buffalo about 4 or 5 years ago. It's called Death is But a Dream. It's all about how people who are in the natural dying process in terminal care and hospice go through the same kind of life review events, et cetera, that NDEers do. So
Mm.
there's a complaint out there in the materialist world, I want to know what happens when you really die, and near-death experiencers don't really die. Well, Christopher Kerr answers that question very powerfully because in his hospice population, 99%, I'm sorry, 86% of those patients had a profound end-of-life dream or vision that kind of helped them make resolution of their life. Excuse me. And 99% of those who had those visions, about 86%, 99% of them said they were more real than real life events. So
Okay.
life review, these kinds of things are a reliving of events. They're set in a stage, a part of the universe that is eternal, that's outside of space and time and the flow of time. I mean, when you witness that in life reviews, people have birth, death, everything in between, all available to them simultaneously, you start to realize, well, that can be an incredibly rich theater of understanding. When you're not just living your life forward in this narrative, but you're actually able to kind of see all these points in their relationships, and it's just a very powerful thing to go through. And not only that, you realize that you're experiencing the life review from the perspective of others. So if you were, hurting others, etc., it doesn't feel good in that life review. And so gently, these life reviews are nudging us towards kindness and compassion. And this is shown if you look, for example, at a graph of violent crime and property crime and battlefield deaths and things like that over the last century or so, you'll find there's a tremendous decline in violent crime and in property crime and in battlefield deaths. Now, the battlefield deaths, of course, with Ukraine and with this Hamas Israel conflict, we've had a bump in that lately. But by and large, the trends have been gigantic over the last many decades, that all of this is improving, that humanity is slowly improving. And I saw something on the news the other day, kind of musing over how can this be? And to me, I think life reviews progressively nudging us towards love, compassion, and kindness certainly could be part of the explanation.
Do you feel like it's a concerted effort to keep people away from, is there a, I don't want to say conspiracy, but is there is there a reason why they are projecting this fear into our society with the news? You turn on the news, it's pretty much always fear-based or negative. Do you feel like
Well,
there's Mhm.
it's kind of like, the ego.
Yeah.
Fear and anxiety are what gets your attention. And so similarly, in our modern era of political polarization, you have some people that are trying to take advantage of fear and anxiety and
Mhm.
trying to use those to drive a wedge,
Mhm.
basically, between people who are prone to that kind of argument and those of us who are more open to kind of a broader sense of seeing humanity and human spirit in a very positive light and having positive attributes. So to me, this is really just a question of attraction and illuminating. This is why I love sharing my story, and so glad that you asked me to be on today,
Thank you.
is because of trying to change this world, you really have to impact it, at every point you can. And I
Right.
realized early on I should never expect people to come where I am, but to meet them where they are.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it's so important to get these stories out there. The more the world knows about near-death experiences, the more they know about this revolution in science, about the nature of consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality, and how promising and optimistic it can be about the future of humanity. Because there is an optimistic and beautiful way forward, and it doesn't involve the fear and anxiety of those fear mongers. And this is, I think, the light that we need to shine out to this world to attract people to a much more appealing form of influence in basically getting their needs met and making a physical reality emerge in a form that's consistent with their ideals. And this is something that I think is within all of our power, but we need to awaken to this. And I'll also point out that in terms of supporting my contention that this is a scientific revolution, for people who want more information on that, you can, for one thing, read Living in a Mindful Universe or read the 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven, which has 36 additional pages in it. But also, you can go to scientificandmedical.net or galileocommission.org. I'm on the scientific advisory board for both groups, and you will find that there's a tremendous amount of material there supporting how this primacy of consciousness is an emerging scientific revolution that will change this world for the better.
Awesome. Awesome. So one more quick question. Did you had mentioned that in people's NDEs that they report that the reality that they're experiencing during the NDE is more real than this world. Did you experience that yourself when you were
Well, absolutely. That was the thing that was so shocking. Now, it was not something I was aware of in The Earth Were My View, where it all started. But then I ascended through that musical light portal up into that rich, ultra real Gateway Valley. And that is the astonishing thing, completely unexpected. I think that's one of the problems is modern science would benefit if we could somehow duplicate and come up with what are called drivers to allow people to readily get to these states. And that's the kind of work that we like doing with meditation. And I'm convinced that as we improve our meditative techniques, that we'll end up coming up with a pretty reliable way of allowing everyone to start accessing that spiritual realm much more readily. But that ultra reality is stunning, and a lot of it comes from the fact that when you're truly into that realm, you have escaped the little river of time, of earth flow of time that we're so used to living in these bodies. And you've really gotten into that timeless, eternal realm, the same realm where birth, death, everything in between, past lives, even future lives can be visualized. I don't want to imply there that this is a deterministic universe when I talk about future lives. But in fact, there's always this eternal now. This is where we live and kind of come things come into understanding. This is where we integrate and assimilate all the information. And all we're starting to realize is that eternal now is, in fact, eternity when we have that broader view of looking at it. And that's where that sense of ultra reality comes from. When you can witness things in such a profound fashion, you start to appreciate their interconnections and their kind of relatability between those various facets of what you're witnessing.
Wow,
And so this is all about kind of an expanded level of transcendental conscious awareness.
beautiful. I love it. I want to just thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I'm so excited just to talk to you, and I'm excited just for more people to hear and understand what you're experiencing. And you being a scientist, it's extra powerful. Is there anything right now that you're particularly working on that you want to tell people about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, I think another book is in process, and that would most likely be related to the soul and the kind of scientific evidence for the reality of the soul. And that I think will really help us rise up to become the intelligent beings that we came here to be,
Mhm.
leaving behind some of the pathetic, bleak and paltry fiction of materialism and some of the other kind of narcissistic and ego-based stories. But there's a far grander world out there for us to expand into, involving the reality of soul. And I think that would be something I will be putting a lot more energy into in the coming weeks and months.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I could be talking to you for hours and hours, so I won't do that. Is there one thing that you want to leave the audience with? Something that an important message that you feel like you want people to
I
understand?
think most importantly, no soul left behind. This revolution has been more than 5,000 years in the making, in this very direct fashion. It's really about improving the lives of all of us and also letting us be better stewards for planet Earth, because sadly, egos and narcissism and corporate greed have really done some damage in the last century or two. And I'm especially talking about climate change, which is a very real existential threat to us all. And we need to take much better responsibility for being stewards of this planet. And that certainly includes getting more into sustainable energy and not continuing to rip resources from a finite resource base on planet Earth, but go much more with sustainable resources and eradicate these warmongering autocrats, dictators, those who promote warfare and violence against fellow beings. We're in the 21st century. It's high time that kind of insane caveman behavior was left in the distant past. And this is all about all of us rising up for the betterment of all of humanity and doing our best to get rid of these vestiges of materialist thinking and false sense of separation that allows for such greed to occur.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. If you would be so kind as to maybe join us again, I would have more questions to ask you. But
Sure. We could do that. In fact, I think to make it even more interesting, I would suggest that at that point we could get Karen Newell involved. She has a tremendous amount of wisdom around spiritual journeying and the spiritual realities of this universe. And I would highly recommend she be part of that conversation. So
Oh
that's
yeah.
all something you can arrange through
Okay.
Zoom and all. So.
Awesome. Awesome.
Kevin, thanks so much for having me on. It's great talking with you today, and I appreciate what you're doing getting this out to the world.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you again. And we'll be in touch. I hope to talk to you again soon.
All right, me too. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye,
Okay.
Kevin. Have a great day.
You as well.